Recently had the opportunity to have a conversation with a man named Galen Lundin, who, if you haven't heard of him, has a somatic approach that is filled with insights and intuition, yet also has some element of structure. He is the epitome of what it is to be outside of the box, and his insights are really clear and concise. The insights in the exchanges that we have in this conversation may be worth their weight in gold. This was a really interesting and exciting conversation, and I hope you enjoy it too.
Sir,
What's up, man?
how you doing?
I'm doing good. A little thirsty.
Yeah.
What's going on in your world?
Oh man, it's just been pretty wild lately. It's been a lot more disorienting and kind of a collapsing of time lately, which is really strange. Just kind of losing a sense of, how there's that regular flow of time that can just show up where you just, the day's going by. It's just, that's been breaking apart pretty rapidly. It never stays, but this has happened before. Something
Yeah.
like that.
Yeah, it's like time and memory can be really interesting because it's like that stability of continuity just starts to slip a little bit. It's like, wait, what?
Yeah.
Just catch yourself. It's like, what?
Yeah.
Oh yeah. It's so weird, but it's like this is what's happening.
Yeah, and they'll reach out and they'll be like, "Yeah, so remember when we talked about this?" And I'm like, "No, I don't."
Remind me. Yeah.
You do one-on-ones, don't you?
Yeah, like I do a lot of work in the relative sense too. Like I work with people's health and fitness a lot, like kind of integrating it through the body because that's a huge part for me. Is just like
Huge.
the nervous system.
It's all the body.
Yeah.
Because that's the number one thing we seem to be bypassing, at least as modern human beings,
Yeah. Yeah. So it's a lot of one-to-one work, especially
Cool.
just getting people healthier, expanding the bandwidth of capacity is like the biggest thing that I've noticed is just that when it's so narrow focused like this, you're just like, and there's like the aperture just closes down so much.
Yeah.
And so just opening that up again is just huge.
These interviews or whatever, it's just to kind of widen perspective. The whole YouTube channel, I don't know if we had a conversation about that. All the money that's made on that channel is just going to go to a nonprofit for people who are looking to wake up, essentially. If they can't afford to do one-on-ones or go to retreats, it's going to help, provide funds for them to be able to do those things. And they ask, "Hey man, will you reach out and get a wider aperture?" Is a good word, by the way. To just get more perspective. And I'd seen so many of your posts on Facebook, and I'm like, yeah, let's just reach out.
Yeah.
There was just a lot of alignment, I guess is the best term. I don't even know what word to use. It just resonated. So what got you started, or the self-discovery in this way? How did that come about?
It was just for like a really long time. I was just naturally curious about whatever this appears to be. It was like always that kind of sense feeling of like, what's actually going on here? Because I wasn't satisfied with any conclusion that I came to. Because it never really made any, it still doesn't make sense, but it just felt like there's a texture or quality that's kind of missing. And so it was like this natural kind of just drive to investigate, to explore, like, where does this actually go to? Where's all of this? How is this being perceived? How is this being interpreted? How am I making sense of something here and someone else is perceiving something differently? It's like there's a lot of different things that are happening always in our experience that we never question, and we just take at face value. I'm like, wait a second, why? Why? I don't need to do that. What's actually going on here? And so it's just like this really curious exploration on the rabbit hole of just like, what is this life experience all about? Because it's never ending. You can never get to the bottom of it. And so it's just like, you could say it's searching for truth in a sense, but it's more of just like immersing yourself with an experience as much as you can, and just being in that state of experiencing more often, as opposed to in this thought realm of just like interpreting, storytelling, and all this other nonsense that goes on. So it's just like getting down the nitty gritty and the mechanics and investigating.
That's it. Direct. Love it.
Yeah.
When you have insights, when you post things, on Facebook or whatever, does that feel like a really immediate kind of thing, or is that something that seems to stew over time, or slowly kind of construct itself as an insight?
It's usually really spontaneous, or someone will say something. I'm like, wait a second, boom. It's usually always like triggered by some type of like environmental stimulus. That just comes in real quick, and it's like, oh, there it is.
Yeah.
If I have to think about something or like investigate too much in the thought realm, it just comes out too like kind of cloudy. But it's just like, you just kind of just like wait. It's like, oh shit, there it is. In the absence of thought, it just lands kind of like that.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I mean, it does seem like the word spontaneous feels a little bit more accurate, where it's just like a spontaneity. It just seems to just show up, boom, and then go with it. Did you run into any like second guessing with that at any point?
When I remember being really, really young, like there's a really high form of like telepathy that would happen almost. Like intuitive telepathy, where I just asked mom a question. She's like, how do you know I was thinking about that? I'm like, I don't know. I didn't know, but I asked it anyway. So it's almost like it's precognitive in the way that we filter information. It's just like that. And so it's much more spontaneous in that way. So it's like, it's really trusting that before you bring out the scales of yes and no behind it.
Love it.
Right. It's like before it goes to that filtering process of trying to understand, does it meet my viewpoints, my reference points? It's just like, you just put that aside and just go.
And it feels so good.
Yeah, because you're not like bringing it through that fog of processing, which is just spiraling back into second guessing again. And you're like, is this right? Is this right? Yes, no. It's like, based off of what?
Right. Exactly. And then you have to investigate that. And then you investigate what that comes up around that, what I appreciate about it is did you ever have a formal sense of self-inquiry? Because I hear curiosity and I hear inquiry, but I don't know if it's, formal. And I think there's something brilliant about that.
What do you mean by like, what were you describing to be formal?
Usually when people will enter into something more in this realm, they can start asking questions like, who am I? What am I? And it tends to be like a hard driven, structured form of self-inquiry. It's just a very formal way to do it. I'm not getting a sense from you that that's really been the case. Have you ever experimented with that?
I have, but I haven't found to be very fruitful, because it almost seems like it's too single pointed. Like it almost comes a fixation to an extent, because you're just kind of seeing it through that lens itself. And so like, I think it can be helpful depending on timing and everything, but it almost seems like it's too much like this, and this gets closed out too much.
Yeah.
So it's like, it depends on like the person and kind of where you're at too. Sometimes you got to switch it up, but it's more of just like resting in the sensory experience and just seeing where attention kind of moves, and then maybe zooming in or coming back out, but not it being like this like really rigid approach, which just doesn't feel right to my system approach it that way.
It does seem to have some benefit for some people, but it can, like when you talked about fixation, that's the best way to put it. It seems like people get to a threshold, and once they've reached that threshold, if there's a fixation, they won't experiment with anything else.
It'll drive you absolutely insane too.
Oh my God. I mean, one of the number one questions, in one-on-ones is it really about inquiry? How long should I stay with it? It's like they want it to be so formulaic, which it's understandable, but this doesn't seem to have a lot of formula. It's really not that predictable,
Yeah, it's one of those things you just kind of got to feel into, and it's like, yep, this is done. Move on to the next thing. It's like kind of like anything else you're engaged with. It's just like, okay, let's move over here. So it's almost like a rhythm without an actual rhythm that you kind of go into. A rhythmless rhythm, if that makes any sense.
Oh, that's
just how you're navigating it.
Perfect way to describe it, actually. Paradoxical, rhythmless rhythm.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of these interviews eventually devolve into really having nothing to talk about because of how deep that paradox goes. But so far, this has been pretty damn fun. Tell me a little bit more about what it is that you do, because I think that might be useful for people to hear too.
Yeah, so usually work with like creatives, entrepreneurs, visionaries who are outside of the box, the traditional business paradigm, and they know they don't fit into the mold of this is who you are, this is what you're supposed to do, because they have like this natural sense of curiosity. And a lot of times what happens is that the way that the senses are being experienced through conditioning and just thought-based patterns and identity patterns, that they kind of confine themselves into this is who I am, this is my mold, this is what I'm supposed to do, and kind of unbinding that whole belief system, that whole identification system. So that, like, we'll call it mental health, right? Like the emotional swings, the highs, the lows, become more stabilized because there's less of this attachment to the content of experience. It doesn't become internalized. It's more like, okay, this is what's happening here, this is what's happening here, and you're still staying within the experience without being caught in what's happening. And using the body to bring it back in the state of equilibrium, or let's call it homeostasis, essentially. So the nervous system, which is really typically under high threat, high stress, starts to come back to here, and all of a sudden you're back in this creative space that's not bound in thought of what I'm supposed to do, how I'm supposed to do it, all these other things. You just kind of move more intuitively with your natural movements. So the body and this nervous system thing is just, it's mind-blowing because it's such a complex thing, you know, from like physiology to bioenergetics to neurobiology. Like all this thing is one working unit, but we often experience as two separate things, or we think about it as being two different things. And it's like, no, no, it's one organism. And so kind of bringing back that holistic approach to it in terms of how we move through life and how we take care of our bodies and exercise and we move to have more of this organic, natural quality and feel to it.
I love that. Is there a specific structure that you put into place for that, or does it have more of an intuitive person-to-person approach?
Both. It's kind of like, let's see kind of what mold we're working with, and so let's see what we can kind of fit within this. So like, let's say we're working with a client who wants to be more aesthetic, so to speak. So it's more like, you know, strength training, things like that. And some people need more mobility, but it's all really about, you know, what is the experience you want to have in your body? Because everyone's going to be a little bit different. For most people, they just want to feel better, move better. And, you know, there's some vanity there, which is cool. But it's really about how can I feel the best in this, this vessel that I'm experiencing, and in a way that allows you to actually deepen into the experience of the body at a more intimate level. So everyone's kind of got their own thing, but it's, what do you want, essentially? How can we make it work?
How do people usually find you?
Facebook. Most of it's on Facebook. Yeah.
That's pretty cool. And most of your clientele, you were, we were talking a little bit earlier. You just work with them online. Is it a similar format to like Zoom kind of thing? Is there?
Yeah, Zoom and a lot of Voxer work, actually. So walkie-talkie, long messages typically.
Yeah, that's perfect. So, I mean, it's a little bit more real time sometimes.
Yeah, a lot of it's real time, because I like to move as fast as we can when we need to. And so it's just one message back and forth instead of having to wait another week before a call, whatever. It's like, I like speed when it's appropriate to use speed, you know? Yeah. So why have to wait a long time before something needs to be talked about? We can just, you know.
Yeah, the momentum kind of dies a little bit sometimes. Yeah, that's experienced here too, where some people like to take big swaths of time before they reach back out. And what's usually discovered is, you reached out too late, essentially. Like you've already kind of gone re-immersed, and we have to do a little bit of start over here, you know? So,
yeah, there appears to be like a window that happens. Right? It's like you're trying to shoot that gap of that window when it comes about, because otherwise you kind of go back into, and then you come back out of it again. Totally. Apparently. But it's like when that sweet spot is there, then it's like that's the entry point of whatever's occurring.
Yeah.
And so it's like if we can just figure out where that is and we can just make that shift where it's needed to be made, then it's just like, it creates that, the unfolding effect seems to speed up quite a bit.
Yeah. And then is it more of a sense of, where somebody is with that, or do you rely mostly on what their feedback is in that regard?
Both, because sometimes you have that sense without knowing exactly what it is. Like, it's an intuitive sense of, I thought about this, I'm not sure why I'm thinking about it, but let's see if there's something there.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's like, I don't have any evidence to support that outside of whatever just comes in the moment, but let's see if this is true or not.
I love that. It's so wild how that shows up too, because the classic mind, or the classic relationship with the world, was it must be backed by evidence, or it's not approached. And whatever this intuition seems to be, it's really clear there's something to reach out about. And I mean, I don't know about you, but the accuracy here is pretty much 100%. It's shocking how accurate.
It's like, even if it starts like a little bit of thread or something, like it may not be exactly it, but what it leads to is like, oh shit.
Yeah.
That's what it is. Right. You go from this wide funnel, and it's like, yep. And so it's just like exploring whatever that initial inkling or that thread is, and seeing where that takes you, is where it's at essentially for me.
Yeah.
Because there's just that feeling tone about something is just here. I don't know what it is, but we should probably investigate this a little more, because it's got a substanceless substance to it.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. That's the best way to put it, actually. What about in terms of relationship? Is there like an overlap in what you do in the practice? And is there, what does that look like for you? Just in your personal relationships, romantic relationships, etc. Are there any of these aspects that, does it ever feel like it needs to be shared in a specific way? Or, do people share this with you, the relationships that you have?
Not exactly. I mean, I want to talk about this with everybody. Like, I'm not going to have like a normal conversation with someone off the street about it necessarily, but sometimes if there's that, the curiosity is kind of there, we'll talk about it. But it's kind of like, it gets expressed in ways that don't need to be talked about in the formal way of talking about it, if that makes sense.
It does.
Right? It's just the way interaction kind of unfolds without it being about that thing itself.
Yeah. There's just been a lot of questions as a theme lately with one-on-ones and stuff on the YouTube channel about relationships altogether. And so that's just where the energy seems to be going at the moment, in terms of, like, is there anything you have found with relationships, maybe with clientele or anything like that, conflict, any of those aspects that seem to show up?
The biggest thing is reactivity in relationships, especially with men. It's like, I want you to calm down so I can calm down.
Yeah.
Right? It's that control mechanism of, I want you to be a certain way so I can feel better about myself.
Totally.
Right? So it's always about like this reactivity of someone else's energy, or how it's being interpreted, that essentially leads to the conflict, because you get caught up in whatever else is happening out here instead of staying here. So it's like, once that starts to die down, and those patterns of reactivity and control start to come down, it's like, well, there isn't really a problem here, the way that I thought it was.
And always like
right?
that.
Yeah. So like, reactivity is the biggest thing, and just like all that anger and that resentment, and he should have done this, she should have done that, all of these things that are just not what's actually happening, right? It's just what's interpreted to be.
Not at all. As a dual form of existence, a feminine energetic space and a masculine energetic space, oil and water, there is no agreement at all as a dual experience.
It's that fixing thing of the relationship that's not founded on actually what's going on. You're trying to fix something that's not even a problem to begin with, and it just leads to more delusion, more distortion, because relationships aren't meant to be fixed to begin with.
Right.
I mean, once you try going down the analytical route of trying to solve the problem of a relationship, you're not in a relationship.
Well, and it's creating the problem too. I mean, once you have a frame that there's something that needs to be fixed, there's always going to be something that needs to be fixed.
Mm-hmm.
You can't escape that. You have to fill the frame.
Yeah.
It's basically a huge game of confirmation bias playing itself out, right? So
Yep.
that's a big chunk. That's a big piece right there too. But I do like how you pointed out, that really it shows up here. It shows up here. It shows up here. It seems like
Mhm.
there's a lot of finger pointing when reactivity and triggers start to, show up. And
I mean, that's just like the natural inclination, is that it seems like it's coming from out there,
yeah,
right? It's just this automatic response. But when you really look at it, what makes that different than this? Why am I responding this way to this person, not to this person? What's actually here that's causing this impulse outside of my own interpretations? And it's like, well, maybe they're not actually correct. Maybe.
I love that. I mean, certainty is basically where experiences go to die. Once we're certain, we just don't play with it anymore. And
Mhm.
what if you just add the word maybe at the end of every notion that feels certain? And as just a general practice, that's an invitation for more curiosity. Like it can even be moment to moment. Like this sensation hurts. Maybe. I mean, it can apply to everything. They're
Mhm.
being an asshole. Maybe. Like it gets pretty interesting from there. So I like that you brought up maybe.
Yeah, I think that the quicker that we arrive at a conclusion about something and take it to be fact is when you start shooting yourself in the foot, because we think it's only this deep and it's endless, right? But it's such a defense mechanism to think that we have things figured out, in this way of like protecting ourselves in terms of, this is my model of the world, these are my reference points, and as long as this feels stable, I feel safe and certain, secure. But if you question that, there's nothing there. There's absolutely nothing there.
It's just absolute nothing. Yeah, and that can be, I mean, did you have a period where you were doing that and that became really unnerving? Was there like an unfolding where it became really uncomfortable for you?
Yes and no. It's always the way I've kind of felt about things, but there was more awareness as to the actual depth of it.
Mm-hmm.
For most of my life, like I've been pretty good being able to move through situations without. So when I was really young, I had really bad anxiety. Like when I was probably like 12, 13, and 14, like it was just crippling social anxiety. And I needed to like know everything in order to feel safe. And over the years, that kind of went away for the most part.
Hmm.
But now it's like actually deepening into the fact that whatever reference points we do have don't really hold up outside of what we confirm them to be. So now it's just deepening into that awareness. Before it was a little more structured. Now the scaffolding's coming down even faster. So
It really is this effortless overall. It just depends on how much the identity or these thoughts or how much attachment or fixation or how much we want to dig in. But I think pointing to when you were younger, a lot of people have these experiences that they had when they were younger, and then something became a very intense fixation along the way. And so it sounds like largely that hasn't really been the case for you, which I think is great.
Yeah, I mean, it still show up sometimes in like certain different areas a little bit, but it's not this pervasive thing where it was like the totality of experience
Right.
was like this sense of unease and like threat and uncertainty.
Totally. If I were to, this is a big one too. And I think it's great that you brought up anxiety. If I were to have somebody ask you, okay, I'm dealing with a shitload of anxiety and I don't know what to do. It's paralyzing. I can't handle it. What would you usually point to in that place?
What is the sensation you're experiencing? What is this loop between what you're thinking about and the sensation you're experiencing in the body? And is there a connection between the thought and the sensation itself?
Yeah.
Right? Because it's like, am I actually feeling aliveness that I've conditioned myself to believe there's something wrong? Like this surge of energy? Well, what is that actually pointing to?
Uh-huh.
It could be like this tension in the body. Well, is it excitement or is it catastrophe? What is it? And if you just kind of notice where the thought goes, like what is actually orienting you towards that thought to begin with?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So it's like kind of breaking up these predictions that we have around sensory experience and the conclusion, because it's usually like from life experience, it's habitual based off of memory. I had this one experience once. If I feel this way, this is what it means about me. This is what it means about somebody else. This is what it means about the situation. But in the absence of that memory, what's here right now.
Man, it's shocking how much you and I point the same exact way. It's just shocking.
Mhm.
It seems really this fundamentally simple, just to engage with what is being felt and watch what the thought is telling you about what is being felt.
Mhm.
So interesting.
Yeah. And it's just once you get in the pattern of doing that too, it almost becomes more natural and intuitive. So instead of being like this, initially it's kind of like more of a heady experience where it's a lot more cognitive. And then it's just more like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
And it just becomes like this natural sloughing away of identification with sensation and thought. It's like, oh, that has to be cleaned up. Good. There seems to be like these different like breaking points in each form that once you kind of get through it, then it just becomes that much faster based off of wherever like this fixation thing is. So it's not so much like this game of like repetitive whack-a-mole. Once you hit that mole down, it's not the same one coming up over and over again, because you kind of just like, you orient yourself in an entirely different way because you can see where these distortions were taking place. And so it's just a matter of like staying alert and staying aware, but at the same time, not letting it be like this whole psychological thing you're constantly over analyzing, because that too is like taking away from the actual experience.
Absolutely. Yeah. There is, it's so difficult to put our finger on, but there is an absolute difference between vigilance and being psychologically aware of something. It's a different, just a different feeling to it. Like awareness itself doesn't really take up much energy at all. It's natural.
Yeah.
It's all,
You can do anything.
but the manager, man, that can be exhausting. So, um, it's, I've never really been able to point to what that really looks like for anyone, but the only thing I can say is, you know it for yourself. You just know. If you continue engaging, you'll just have a sense of, oh, and that, I guess, is what we could call a realization.
Yeah. It's like it's more like this. The hypervigilance seems like it's a much more distorted form of awareness, and like this natural curiosity of awareness is so much more innocent. It's a lot lighter, because the hypervigilant approach just feels so dense, and you're just like, I gotta figure this shit out. And it's like, damn, that's not a good way to go about doing this. You're just gonna burn yourself out and get even more frustrated. But it's just like, all right, I'll be innocent and curious about this, like Christmas morning or going out for a walk. Then you just take all that tension off of trying to figure it out, and it just starts to percolate and come up naturally on its own.
Yeah, you're okay. I'm picking up an essence of something here. It's almost like the difference between a hard, desperate, single pointed focus and one that is more relaxed and wider is almost what that seems to be. Maybe there's something there.
Yeah. It's like more of a panoramic experience versus it being like this hyper like laser beam experience.
That's the way to put it. I think that's it. Nice.
Yeah. It just feels better. I think that some people are more like inclined to be like, especially people who are really driven in this like hard work, discipline, grit, kind of resonate with that single point approach, because that's the way the mentality is. Sometimes it'll work, but it's like, let's flip this and see what actually happens. Let's get you out of this really hard determined way of looking at something, and let's have it be a little more flexible, a little more malleable, so it's less rigid, and see what shows up. Because usually for people, it's the inverse of how they normally operate. The juxtaposition is what has to be addressed, because that's what kind of created the issue to begin with.
Yeah.
Let's flip this whole thing on its head and see what shows up.
Totally. It's almost like the Siddhartha story, how he grew up in this extremely wealthy environment and might have inherited the wealthiest kingdom known to man at the time. And then he leaves all that and becomes completely ascetic, and he's like dying in the sun and he's starving himself. And then somewhere in between those two extremes of experience, he finds that Bodhi tree right in the middle. It's like, if we look at it from a distance as a metaphor, that it's actually a pretty powerful pointing. And that shows up here often too, is like, break that fucking pattern, break it. Yeah. Mess with it. Every time you find a pattern of anything, be willing to play outside of that. So if you're used to drinking coffee every morning and reading a paper, whatever your pattern is, skip the coffee and see what comes up.
Yeah. It's so funny how like some forms of conditioning are like really useful, like taking a shower, knowing how to drive a car, like these basic things. But at
Totally.
the same time, I also don't know how much of a routine that puts us in that's actually counterintuitive to how we actually want to move.
Hmm.
Like we just think, well, this is my routine. Well, based off of what?
Right. For what?
For what? This is the way I have my life structured. Why? You ever think about that?
You ever asked why?
Yeah.
It
Well, this
just,
is what I do. Okay. Well, is there anything else you want to do that's outside the box of your structure of what you do?
yeah.
Maybe. See what that is.
Yeah. I like it. Oh man. So many bits and pieces within that too. Yeah, what comes up is the metaphor along the lines of an autoimmune disorder. When the immune system starts going after healthy tissue, that's when it's essentially gone past the point of equilibrium, right? It's doing something more. It seems like patterns can be that way too. They can serve a wonderful purpose, but they can also pass the point of equilibrium. And also the way identity and thoughts tend to function, it can be that way too. Because it doesn't seem like thoughts have any benefit or bearing on our well-being at all. They can label it, they can tell us a great
Yeah.
story about it, but they have no bearing. So it's essentially like an autoimmune disorder happening on a psychological level, you know?
Yeah. It's funny how, like, this idea of like positive self-talk and trying to reframe our perspective doesn't actually shift what's really happening. It's just a thought changing another thought that feels better.
Yeah.
But in reality, nothing is actually experientially shifted except for clinging to the better thought. So it's like maybe marginally improve it a little bit,
Mhm.
but you also got to know when you're just bullshitting yourself.
Right. Yeah. You're
You're
just
just bullshitting yourself.
you're replacing one story with another one. It's essentially the same thing. When you brought up out of the box to move outside of the box, that's what it is. The thoughts themselves are the box. What's outside of the
Mm-hmm.
thoughts? It's not about a better thought.
Mm-hmm.
That would be like attempting to make a screwdriver with a screwdriver.
Yeah, yeah. But it's funny how that way of thinking has been also so conditioned in terms, like you say, modern psychology and positive thinking. And it's
Totally.
like such a limited use to that because you're just adding more layers on top of that, on top of what's actually happening. And you just kind of get stuck in that realm of trying to shift your thinking about something instead of seeing it more clearly for what it actually is.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is actually a pretty effortless experience. Just it is.
Mm-hmm.
It is what it is.
Mm-hmm.
Which is
Yeah.
a thing to say. Sometimes people don't like that, but it really is what it is.
Yeah, that can be frustrating, but that's also kind of what's needed sometimes too. Just
Yeah.
that period
Yeah.
of frustration.
I really appreciate how direct you are. Just it just comes straight out. Have you ever run into any friction with that?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah, all the time. But that's okay because everyone's allowed to have their own experience of me.
Hmm.
And so it's their right to experience themselves in the way they want to, and they can experience me the way they want to. Right.
Mhm.
It's like when we try to control other people's experience of us,
Yeah.
that's when it goes to this distorted PR machine of I hope they like me, I hope they accept me, I want to be validated. And it's like
Juicy.
that's so much mental efforting and suppression that happens when you're in that state. Because what they actually want is to be able to do the same thing for themselves. That's kind of where that trigger is. It's like, oh fuck, I want to be able to do that. So it gets projected back out.
That's actually a perfect statement too. How often are we manipulating someone else's experience of us? Oof.
Mm-hmm.
Just paying attention to that, there could be quite a few juicy bits there. I like it.
Oh, it's huge. And it happens at a level that we're not even aware of because it happens to be so habitual, especially around certain people that we have this long lasting relationship. It's like, this is how I act in front of this person. This is how I act in front of this person. And so you're constantly shifting through these different identities in terms of this is how this person expects me to be in front of them. And you put yourself in a new little jacket and you present yourself and you take it off and you put on a new one. It's like, well, how many of these me's are there walking around the world? It's endless. Exhausting if you look at it that way.
All the world's a stage, man, and the masks are seemingly infinite. The experience here was there were these auxiliary identities, just like what you're talking about. There was like, okay, This was the Josh at work identity. This was the Josh in a romantic relationship identity. This was the Josh around family and friends identity. And they were all these bits and pieces. And as those kind of started to crumble, when there was just a noticing, then there was something more fundamental that was absolutely brutal. And it was this, just this, it was very fundamentally, some things were yes, easily accepted. And then there was this hell no in a lot of other places. And that hell no, that was, it seemed to be the very crux of suffering altogether, or just pain. It just hurt. The no hurts.
Yeah, you can feel that contraction in your system where you're just like, ugh, where I'm not expressing what I want to express, or I'm holding back. It's like you just feel that it's such like this dense, energetic feeling.
Definitely.
And like that level of authenticity is initially challenging to express because it goes completely against that pattern of conditioned interaction. But once you do, it's like, oh shit, it feels so much better. I don't have to keep acting this way around people. That's not actually who I am. And once you start doing that more often, the stakes that you think that are behind doing that, like, oh shit, it was almost imagined.
Yeah.
I made the whole thing up in my head.
Yeah, I had an exploration the other day with somebody who was experiencing social anxiety. And I was like, well, what thoughts are arising and what does the sensation feel like? And basically it was, they're judging me. I'm less than. It was just, the classic, I'm not good enough. And when they realized, and I said, start having conversations with people and see what it's like to get really honest with people. Just see what it's like. And he started expressing these things to other people, and they were saying, I'm feeling the same exact way. It was like everyone was playing the same game, and it was like taking two poles of the same poles of a magnet, attempting to push it together, and there's resistance there. So interesting. And it was all hype. It's all just oriented around a narrative and thought that is just, it's a huge assumption. It's not even there.
Right. Yeah. It's like you're orbiting around the same thing, but no one's really willing to recognize or say it. But you're dancing around the same fire. It's like, do you know what's going on here? Like, it's funny because you can feel that happening energetically, even though you don't say anything about it. Like, you may have some thoughts about it, but you can just kind of feel that restraint. You can just feel that apprehension come up.
Always. It's amazing how much it's felt. So going back to conflict or any even conversation, there's content and then there's something else that's much more. It's just so clear. And maybe it seems subtle for people at first, but the thing that is really obvious is everyone feels it. Everyone knows in some way that you have a connection with it.
Yeah. And kind of like back to this body piece, like once you start getting back into this, that becomes more and more aware because you're not shying away from that sensation and going to this interpretive realm. So it's like once this starts to come more online, then it's like, oh shit, there's a different way of orienting here that's not going to be about my thoughts about something.
Love it, man. It's pretty powerful stuff.
Yeah, but you mentioned like that social anxiety piece about like not being good enough, and that's like such a core thing with human identity. And it's just so interesting, like when you actually investigate what that actually means, like what does it mean not to be good enough, and based off of what?
That's a perfect question. How can you be measured?
Right. And it's just like the way that we use language and how like all of this is just built off of words.
Yeah.
And like once you start to break down like any form of definition or label, it just doesn't apply to anything. Like relatively sure it's useful, but when it comes to this identity, it's like what's actually like what? Where is it? Where is this good enough? Yeah. It's not in my foot, it's not in my finger. Where can I find this label or identity that I have? And it doesn't have any inherent existence.
Yeah, and I love how you found that link with language too, because it really does seem to be this really ancient mechanism of conformity, which actually makes sense in a survival situation, right? If you and I were part of a tribe and we go out and we slaughter a mammoth And we come back to the tribe and I'm like, oh yeah, I was on top of this hill and I came down, and you're like, yeah, and I was down below it and I was going like this with the spear. We have our story, we have language, we're creating value, we're creating something that the tribe needs, the sense of identity, the sense of conformity. And if I do something outside of what conforms, I might get kicked out of the tribe. And if that's the case, I'm going to die.
Yeah. Yeah. That survival tribalism is such a core part of like all of this. And what's interesting too is that because we have evolved on this cultural level, but our primitive brain structures and our biology really hasn't changed that much.
Mm-hmm.
And so like the sensory input we have now from the world is so much higher, the speed of information, but like our physiological bodies almost haven't found a way to catch up to it. It's like it's almost overbearing to an extent. And so physiology hasn't changed, but our world has changed so much. And so it kind of creates this discrepancy of like, how can we interpret this in a clearer way without defaulting to, survival mechanisms, just tribalism. And there's certain like human needs we need to have met, but if you don't really investigate what's going on, you're kind of be stuck in a pattern that isn't really the truth of what's happening.
Yeah, there's like a reification too in that tribal structure. It really seems to boil down to, on a fundamental way, common pain. That's what we're sharing. Common struggle, common suffering. That's why we're together, because this is survival. Oof. So one of the questions that comes up is this about survival, or is there something else for you? And when people start to realize all the ways that they're surviving, they begin to start questioning if it's necessary at all. Do I need to survive? Is there a bear? Is there a bear here?
Yep.
What is there to protect?
Yeah.
That part right there is what I would just consider engagement with courage or risk. How does that show up for you, or how has it shown up in terms of sometimes we got to take risks? We got to like really push what feels like a limitation.
Yeah. So, I mean, the way that I see it is when someone's constantly in a state of survival, their nervous system is like searching for threats constantly. Like at a biological level, that's what we do to make sure this body is safe. But then it starts identifying things that aren't physiological threats. They're only perceived psychological threats. And so you're always just like boom, 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 hyper fixated on objects and appearances. And so it's like once you can kind of bring that back a little bit, then it's like, oh shit, there's actually nothing really here. But because the patterning in the nervous system just overwires everything else, it's really hard to do it just through the psychological aspect without bringing back down that tone in the nervous system. Because once it does do that, it's going to happen more effortlessly. And so it's like just bringing down that threat response is like the most important thing I think you could ever possibly do in your life.
Yeah.
Everything is being interpreted through that sensory experience and the thoughts and the patterning over and over again.
Beautiful. Yeah. And that's pointing toward anxiety a little bit too.
And stress and overwhelm and like all these bad like emotions that feel like they're too much. It's like all of that can just kind of have this nicer equilibrium where it doesn't feel like it's going to fucking kill me just because you start interpreting it in an entirely different way. So just investigating that, like, what's actually happening here? Is this real or is this imagined? What's the truth of what's actually going on?
I love it.
Once it starts to come down a little bit, then there's like a whole cascade that follows based off of conclusions that weren't actually real.
Yeah. I love that. Is there anything in particular that seems to be a pattern of how you do that with people?
So I think movement's really important, just because there's so much emotional repression in the body, and there's a lot of, I mean, if you look at the typical American posture, right? It's like people are like this, their low backs hurt, their upper back is tight, they're chest breathers, which causes anxiety because they're not taking full breaths. And so just working with the body in terms of having it move better and improving the physiology naturally brings down the threat level. Like you feel better when you're exercising and eating well. And so naturally, like your entire energy system starts to shift. So that's a big part of it, is just moving your body in ways that you normally don't. It can just be going for a walk. If you never go for a walk, just go out for a walk and see where it takes you. So there's a lot of like somatic work I think is really important that's overlooked, because there's only so much we can go through with the mind without having going through the actual experience of the body itself.
Yeah.
Like once you start like releasing trauma, and it's not even like this conscious thought period, it's like I'm moving my body, all of a sudden like I feel lighter, and I don't know why, but something that was there isn't there.
Mm.
And the more this starts to clear up, then the more that you start to become engaged in life instead of being in the survival threat state. So my lens is always going to be through the body foremost. And then this stuff works in tandem, but it's like, take care of yourself, because it's going to ripple out in ways that you can't possibly imagine.
I love it. I love it. I actually think there's so much wisdom there, and it's going to be so useful for a lot of people to just have this introduced to them. Truly. I don't know how to describe it. It's just saying, yep, 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 the whole time. I love it. And the way that you describe it, there's a softness to that too, that just makes it easier for people to go, okay, I see it now, versus all you got to do is exercise. There's a different energy with that, right?
Yeah.
It's not about the act itself. There's still some kind of intention with it. That's kind of poetic.
Yeah, because the way that most fitness is approached is like, I have to change my body, I have to lose fat, I have to look a certain way. It's like, that's not the lens to look at it through, because then you become hyper fixated on that.
Yeah.
It's like, let's create a more intimate experience within your body, and that'll take care of itself. Once that's there, you're going to release the weight, right? It's like shifting that lens, right? Everything is backwards.
That's so good, man. So good. This conversation's been perfection.
It couldn't be any other way.
The variety of approaches that are all essentially pointing the same way. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate just the earnestness and the engagement that you bring to the table, for sure.
Yeah. What's really cool about this too is everyone has their own type of flavor and lens on it based off of like who they are. And you can just see the different diversity and the eclecticness in terms of how all of us express ourselves. And like, once you can just start putting kind of these pieces of the puzzle together, it's like, okay, this and this and this and this. It's not just one thing. It's not just one way. It's never ending.
Yeah. You know? I mean, you used a word that I think really sums it up, and holistic. There's something holistic.
Yeah.
And I do like how you use the word intimacy too. Intimacy in the body. That's a really nice way to put it.
Yeah. And it's a naturalness that starts to come over, because where there's like a lot of rigidity and rejection, like you just find that the way that you move and express your body becomes so much more fluid. Where oftentimes people are just like very rigid and very tight. And just like, it's like, just let it go.
It's just a really cool somatic approach. You know, I work with some people that do TRE too, just as facilitators, and that definitely has a value as well. But I think having more access to whatever feels most natural, and for all of us, is really beneficial. And I have a sense that there's a lot of people out there that, if they just allow themselves to develop that intimacy, that reconciliation with their body, that more will become readily apparent, effortlessly.
Yeah. It's going to show up in ways that you couldn't possibly imagine that it would, right? It's like, you can't possibly guess or imagine what's going to happen from it. There's no way of knowing. But usually that's the doubt mass that's right there. Because I think I know what the outcome is going to be. I think I know what I'm going to get, yada, yada, yada. But it's like, you've got no idea. You've got no idea.
Which is kind of exciting, actually.
Or terrifying,
right?
Depending on how you live your life. If I need to know what the outcome is going to be, and I don't, I'm not going to do it. It's like, really?
Ultimately the same experience, but you're right. That's it. It's like, that's the paradox. Excitement, terror, excitement, terror. There's so much of that. That's beautiful. Yeah. A really structured life, having no clue what's about to happen. That's probably terror.
Yeah, but you never know what's going to happen anyway. So
right.
What's that based on?
Like, what are you hanging on to? So you predict with 100% accuracy. All right.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a good guess at best, and with a lot of confirmation bias, based off of interpretation.
Shitload of gambling going on. And some people are not very good at it. Most of us aren't.
Yeah. I don't gamble anymore. I used to play poker quite a bit when I was younger, but now it's just like, no. I'll gamble in the next moment and see what shows up instead.
Yeah. That's the essence of it all. Oh. Well, I really appreciate it. Seriously. This was good. Good stuff.
Yeah, it's fun. Anytime that I get to talk about this too, I say things I didn't even know I was going to say.
Isn't that the best?
That's the best part of it.
Yeah, there was a lot of really bright insight here, and that's going to be great for the listeners too. So anyway, thanks. Really appreciate it. And
my pleasure. Thanks for reaching out.